Hello, welcome everyone. It's so wonderful to have you here on a beautiful sunny day. My name is JOVANNA SCORSONE. I'm the Manager of Education and Public Engagement here at the Aga Khan Museum. Very happy to welcome you as we explore artistic pluralism in the medieval Mediterranean. We here at the museum are always looking for opportunities to connect cultures through art. We've seen through history how the sharing of ideas across cultures is nothing new, whether through music or through art that survives in the physical form through generations. Even on our site today, where the Aga Khan Museum sits, the land known as Takaranto, we acknowledge that this site has been the home to many rich and artistic cultures for millennia. Most recently, the Huron-Wendat, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Mississaugas of the New Credit. We're thankful for their stewardship of this territory and the richness of culture that continues to influence our lives here today. And now, continuing with that idea of exploring cultures and the artistic expression of culture, allow me to introduce our head of performing arts, Amirali Alibai, who will introduce our musical performance, Lute Legends.
Hi, welcome. I'm really excited about today's performance and very grateful to FILIZ for suggesting that there be music part of this event today. I think it's very important, and as a museum, we're involved in not just the tangible but the intangible cultures, aspects of culture, when we're exploring and trying to make connections between cultures. And so the ensemble that we've invited to perform for you today was picked and selected with that in mind. Each of the artists, it's a trio that you'll see this afternoon, have performed here in different ensembles, including Italian and Greek and Middle Eastern and Chinese. In fact, the pipa player Wen Zhao performed at the opening of the museum for almost 5 years ago. Demetrios Petsalakis, who's playing the oud, has performed here in many different ensembles, including a band called Mosquito Bar, and actually quite recently he performed on this very stage just a couple of weeks ago with another trio that he was working with. And we also have Lucas Harris, who's playing the lute. He's worked here with Vesuvius Ensemble, which is an Italian ensemble. And so this particular group is called Lute Legends, and they're bringing together these instruments. I think of it almost like a family reunion of these instruments. The oldest ancestor in amongst them is the oud, laoud. It's an instrument that, in the British Museum, there's a seal that suggests that it's 3,500 to 3,200 BCE, were the first mention of the oud. It was certainly played in Pharaonic Egypt, and it, of course, was brought to Al-Andalus in the 8th century, 8th, 9th century by Ziryab from Iraq. And in the 4th century, this instrument found its way into China and evolved into the instrument that you'll see Wen Zhao playing this afternoon, the pipa. And these artists are drawing on different musical traditions, including Chinese and Turkish and Arabic. And I'm sure you'll feel some Greek from Dimitri as well. And they really function as a group of artists that are in dialogue with one another through their art. I don't think I need to say much more. I'm very excited. I think it's a perfect ensemble for this event, for exploring the Renaissance. And in fact, the lute evolved in the 14th century, 13th, 14th century, and during the Renaissance, because of technology and new ideas, really evolved into the different forms that we see throughout present-day Italy. And of course, there's been a recent Renaissance, a reclaiming of these instruments, many of which were lost for about a century, and musicians like Lucas are bringing them back. So without further ado, please welcome Lute Legends.
Thank you very much. We're so pleased to be here today. It's quite an honor to be performing for such a distinguished group of scholars here. I think Aman has basically given us a fantastic introduction, so you basically get the idea that these three instruments are ancient cousins, and both the lute and the pipa evolved from the oud, which is the grandfather of the other two. So the oud basically went east and kind of evolved into this instrument, and went west and evolved into this instrument. And the more time went on, the more I think the instruments and their techniques and the sounds that they make started to grow apart. And we're interested in exploring, well, first of all, just for the fun of it, we just wanted to see what would happen if these three instruments shared the stage and tried to find something to play together. Just, as Aman said, a kind of reunion of long-lost cousins. And often what we do is we bring pieces that are from one of our three traditions and try to teach it to the other two. And the person whose tradition the piece comes from ends up being kind of the leader of the coach of that piece. The one we've just heard is a piece from the Western world. This is a piece by Joan Ambrosio Dalza, who was a lutenist who published in Venice in 1508. And this was his fourth book of lute music, and I think that it's the only one that survives. And there's something about the structure of this piece. It's basically it's a duet for two lutes, where one lute plays a drone and the other has kind of a written out solo or diminutions, as they would have said at the time. And what we've done with it is we've kind of split up the solo so that each of us sort of takes a part of it, and we're also allowed to add things to other people's solos and even sort of play along with somebody else's solo, just to make it sound more kind of improvisatory. The next piece is one that Dimitri composed, and I'm going to ask him to say a couple of words about it.
So we were asked to play about 2 years ago. We played a concert, and the theme was peace. So Lucas said, "Do you have a composition that we could play together that's referred to peace?" I said, "No, but I'll write something." So I wrote this piece. It comes from the tradition. I studied classical Middle Eastern music. So a big part when you learn classical Middle Eastern music is you learn these pieces called samais. Maybe I'm talking to people that already know this, but it's okay. Review. So these samais are in this specific beat, and they have this chorus that it always comes back to. And there's a theme that we play the main mode in, and then the chorus comes back every time that we move away from the mode. We bring back the kind of the chorus, so we bring back the maqam that we came from. And funny enough, it has 4 verses, so 1, 2, 3, and an extra one for fun. So I said, why don't I write something so that we can play in our own styles in it, in the style of a samai, and then at the end we can play all together and then come back with the chorus. And hopefully you can follow that. And the piece is called In Hope of Peace. 2 years have passed, not much has changed.
our last piece, we're going to play a piece called Send Me a Rose. And this is an arrangement of a folk song that comes from the Uyghur province in China. So you get to hear Wen play the melody. You'll get to hear all of us play the melody at different times, and then we'll open it up for a kind of improvisation in the middle. So I hope you enjoy this. This is called Send Me a Rose. And thank you again so much for the opportunity to play for you today.
Thank you so much for that. It was beautiful to see this musical family reunion and wonderful to see the influences and how well they fit together. So wonderful in our constant search for evidence of pluralism long through history. So thank you very much. And now we start the art history portion of our evening as we discuss the artistic exchanges that occurred between Muslims, Jews, and Christians, exchanges that inspired innovative aesthetic approaches and transcended cultural, linguistic, and religious differences. Now, as the stage crew works to reset the stage for our panelists, please allow me to introduce our curator here at the Aga Khan Museum, Dr. FILIZ Philip, who will speak to our approach here at the museum and welcome our moderator and special friend, Dr. NASSER RABBAT.
Welcome, everyone. It's a very special day for me. We are working with Bradley and Sharon since last May to organize this coming together and bringing all our scholars and our passion topics together. And then I was very excited when NASSER RABBAT accepted our invitation, who is a very good friend and my co-creator from the exhibition in 2016. We created together Syria and Living History. Professor RABBAT is the Aga Khan professor and director of the Aga Khan program for Islamic architecture at the MIT, and he's an architect and historian. His scholarly interests include the history and historiography of Islamic architecture, art, cultures, urban history, modern Arab history, contemporary Arab art, and post-colonial criticism. And today we will focus on Mediterranean artistic pluralism, and he will lead us. Please join me to welcome Professor NASSER RABBAT.
Hello, everyone. It's always a pleasure to stand here. This is not my first time I'm standing here and talking. And this time is the first time I'm actually being the moderator, which is a function that has a very ambiguous definition. I have no idea what a moderator would do, so I'll take a little bit of the privilege to say a few words about what pluralism means. And then I will introduce our speakers, who each will speak for 5 minutes, and then we will have about 30 minutes of discussion and question and answer at the end. The title of our session here is Artistic Pluralism in a Medieval Mediterranean. Pluralism is a word that is rising in the attention of a lot of scholarly, academic, even artistic and museological environment. And it's being brandished these days around as a word to counter a lot of the words that are invading our political realms that are actually focusing on the exact opposite of what pluralism intends to be, namely singularity, insularity, and perhaps actually sort of like biases against the other. Pluralism is intended to actually remind us that we are not alone and that what we are doing is always influenced by the presence of others, other people, other culture, other ethnicities, other artistic tradition, and so on and so forth. Pluralism is a word that somehow encapsulates what this museum was about, still is about. It is a museum that is celebrating the multiplicity of voices in the artistic creation. And hopefully this is what our panelists will be emphasizing today by looking at different moments in the long history of exchange in the Mediterranean between the two sides of the Mediterranean, or perhaps one has to say between the multiple sides of the Mediterranean. But the last thing that I want to say is that I want to introduce another word, and I want to introduce another word to describe, in a sense, another stage of what pluralism is. There is inherent in the word pluralism the notion that there are multiple voices, but each and every one of them is ontologically self-defined, or it's standing on its own. They just come together. I'm much more in favor of a word that sometimes is used, or used to be historically at least used, for a negative effect, and that is the word of hybridity. Because it seems to me that what we were looking at here, listening to the music, is that yes, there are 3 traditions, but what we really, once we start sort of like listening in particular to each and every one of the individual musicians as they are playing their individual instrument, you do realize that not only the movement of the fingers perhaps are shared in some of these traditions, but deep down, these traditions have informed each other to the point where they become part of each other rather than just those standing alone and just basically playing together. The harmony that was produced is by the fact that they share in the identity of each other. And it seems to me that this is what art has done over time, and this is what our artistic traditions have achieved, at least the ones that we are going to be looking at today. My first speaker is Bradley Cavallo, who is an assistant professor at the Department of Art and Design at the Marian University. Bradley, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you also for those who helped to organize this event. The primary way that I consider myself in terms of all of this is that of an educator. And so oftentimes I am faced with the question of, Dr. Cavallo, why does studying history at all matter to us? Again, this is coming from undergraduates. And so this is one response that I would want to share with you. The all too recent massacre of 50 people at the Al Noor and Linwood mosques in Christchurch, New Zealand, reminds us that intolerance begets deadly consequences. History can be weaponized in this context of extremism. through selective misapplication or outright manipulation of historical sources. This type of hateful appropriation or willful ignorance can and must be fought with counter-stories or counter-narratives crafted by those trained in the art of history and who are therefore responsible for and most able to rebuke its abuse, grounded as our discipline is in the reality of evidence verifiable by facts. In this age of personal relativism and growing incredulity about objective information, the notion of so-called facts might seem quaintly naive. And I further appreciate the critical thesis that contemporary historians are Orwellian Winston Smiths who merely rectify history's palimpsest by subjectively reinterpreting it. Certainly, there are those who operate from often influential positions of ethnocentrism, nationalism, or religious solipsism. And yet, precisely because of these individuals or groups or vested interests, it is even more incumbent upon ethically minded historians to position themselves as participants in any and all discussions in which they could contribute information that might guide public opinion in at least the general direction of honest assessments about the past's relation to the present. A relatively recent example of this occurred following the attack in Paris on the offices of the journal Charlie Hebdo on the 7th of January 2015. If you recall, one of the motivations for those murders was that Charlie Hebdo had printed satirical caricatures of the Prophet Muhammad that many found denigrating and contrary to the ostensible aniconism of Islam. University of Michigan's Dr. Christiane Gruber responded almost immediately in her professional capacity as a leading expert on the history of depicting the Prophet in Islamic art by publishing articles in Newsweek, a popular American journal with a wide print and online circulation. Clearly and without baroque but verbiage, Dr. Gruber explained that the Prophet has long appeared in Islamic visual culture because representational art has never been outright forbidden in the Quran, although idolatry is of course condemned, and many hadith make it clear that the Prophet disapproved of image making. In consequence, as she said, the, quote, visual evidence clearly undermines the premise that images of Muhammad are banned in Islamic law and practice, thereby providing us with a less ideologically divisive and more fact-based way to speak about a subject that has grown increasingly contentious. Correctives like Dr. Gruber's matter because they resist ahistorical views, easily disseminated, easily repeated, and so easily believed, whose ideological aims or political power pivot on restructuring collective memory in order to justify present conditions. As John Stuart Mill said in The Subjection of Women, quote, everything which is usual appears normal. Because it sounds like a trite truism, people do not fully appreciate Mill's observation, even though it has very real-world impacts. Disabusing this kind of presentist fallacy requires that historians communicate the extent to which human relationships are mutable, but by revealing how consistently we have changed who we choose to identify as alike or alien to ourselves and how to relate to them. Enacting this process of disrupting historical and cultural prejudices gains strength by gatherings such as ours. The ideas we generate carry over into educational contexts such as museum exhibitions and university courses, wherein we can shape the cultural and historical categorizations and even geographical demarcations by which a multitude of visitors and students arrive at self-conceptions that emphasize alterity or inclusivity. Dr. RABBAT himself, for example, has explored the pedagogical ramifications of applying a, quote, world history perspective to the creation of a survey text of, in his case, Islamic art and architecture that would go beyond the more traditional chronological, thematic, or Eurocentric approaches. Extending his analysis, I would want to query or ask, given our collective and individual interests, is it conceivable to imagine how we could frame the contiguous Mediterranean, and in the case of Vera Simone, the Mediterranean and sub-Saharan African regions as a singular space, porously defined and characterized by artistic pluralism and what Dr. RABBAT has called, quote, patterns of interdependence? I would argue that such a project is absolutely possible, and in fact, I would warrant that we're all here because we believe in that, or at least hope for it. It is possible and also an example of the kind of counter-story or counter-narrative that is necessary to begin the slow work of dislodging intolerance. It will depend on cross-disciplinary collaboration, open-mindedness, if nothing else, and the consideration of questions like those posed by Dr. RABBAT, and that's how I would like to end this. He asks us, how can we maintain the focus on a culturally defined survey, just educationally speaking, without essentializing its segments into normative and timeless categories? And how can we critique the biases of the dominant Western canon without totally discarding the very idea of the canon itself, or turning away from its paradigmatic and instructive examples? Thank you.
Just so that I don't go up and down, we're going to be sitting here, so from now on. My second speaker is Karen Matthews, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Art and Artistry at the University of Miami. Karen?
Well, thank you so much for being here this afternoon, and thank you to Bradley and Sharon for putting this together on the Renaissance Society of America and the Aga Khan Museum and their personnel for inviting us to come to talk to you today, even though I can't really see you. I believe you're out there. And I think we've already had some fabulous examples of this idea of pluralism or hybridity in the musical performance. That is indeed a very tough act to follow, in this idea of shared ancestry, cultural adaptations, but in the end, a dialogue that comes together. And then in the material that Bradley addressed, I believe certainly as someone who has worked on the medieval and early modern Mediterranean for at least 30 years, if not longer, that the past always has something to teach us, and we can learn an extraordinary amount from the sort of society that existed in the Mediterranean in this time period of great flux of, say, the 14th to the 16th to 17th centuries. So the material that I work on, once again, is based in the Mediterranean and is really trying to see the Mediterranean as a unified space, a fluid space, a volatile space, certainly a hybrid space, but one in which there was an extraordinary circulation of ideas and people, concepts, goods, whatever it may be. There was indeed conflict. There were indeed problems, but it was a space that was indeed shared and that was quite dynamic in terms of the cultural interaction. So the work that I'm doing in a current research project relates to the Mamluks, a dynasty that was the subject of a set of presentations that we did at the conference, the Renaissance Society of America. But the idea of the work that I'm doing is to make the Mamluks Mediterranean and to look at how this Islamic dynasty really turned to the vibrant culture of the Mediterranean in order to establish some sense of belonging, some sense of legitimacy, and some sense of connection to the peoples that surrounded the sea. So I'm addressing this topic on the basis of sort of three subjects or themes. And the first is one of spolia, and probably none of you have any idea what that is, but I will of course tell you, right? And spolia is the reuse of cultural artifacts, objects, building materials from other cultures, past and contemporary foreign. And in the work that I do, I show that this idea of spoliation, of borrowing from cultures from the past and borrowing from cultures around you immediately, is one that was a pan-Mediterranean phenomenon. So it existed in the Byzantine Empire, that is in the Eastern Christian realms. It existed in Western Europe, and it existed in the Mamluk dynasty, in Mamluk territories of Egypt and Syria as well. It was a way to connect people to a past that they could recuperate and place themselves in connection to. And it was a way to make connections and to establish them in a larger group with a sense of belonging in their contemporary world as well. And the result of this was extraordinary, encrusted, very lavish monuments that created a dialogue between past and present and moved fluidly between those two realms. The second theme or subject that I'm interested in addressing is that of spectacle, and how display, processions, rituals, and their staging in an urban environment was something that joined peoples around the Mediterranean Sea as well, in that you wanted to sort of show off and present yourself with the greatest light to your own people, but you also wanted to show off to people who came to your capital and to display yourself in the best possible light, and would sort of roll out the red carpet literally and line the streets with silks so that these processions and great ritual events could take place. And then the third aspect of the work that I do really brings it all together in, once again, this hybrid realm of the Mediterranean, in the idea of a shared culture of objects. That objects moved back and forth, things moved as people and ideas did across the Mediterranean in an extraordinarily vibrant and vivid fashion, and that one need not talk about relationships emphasizing origin. This came from X and went to Y, but really a shared culture that people could all appreciate objects of great beauty, great workmanship and craftsmanship, of luxury and wealth, and that united people across religious boundaries, across political boundaries, in a unified Mediterranean that had a shared taste for beautiful, luxurious goods. And then the last sort of topic that I'll be dealing with in a book project that I'm working on is really how the Mamluks themselves, faced with the threat of the Ottomans, this extraordinarily powerful and really quite menacing power that ultimately did take over the Mamluk Empire, how the Mamluks found it expedient and quite worth their while to ally themselves with Western Christian polities and territories in order to face this Ottoman menace with allies and with other Mediterranean friends, as opposed to going it alone. So I think there's a sense that the medieval and early modern Mediterranean can teach us a lot about interconfessional dialogue, about cultural interaction, and truly the importance of this idea of pluralism, but of understanding the contributions that these other cultures can make in your own culture and in your own cultural artifacts. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. We come to the University of Toronto. So my third speaker is Hiba Mustafa, who's Assistant Professor of Islamic Art and Architecture at the Department of History of Art at the University of Toronto. Hiba.
Could I have my first slide, please? Oh, there it is. Okay, thank you. So I'll be showing you two monuments that I've been working on for the past decade. And through these, I sort of want to tell a story of how I approach the cultural encounter. So the first monument you're looking at here is the Dome of the Chain, and right behind it is the Dome of the Rock. Now, this kind of shows the Dome of the Chain as like the younger brother, or the per cousin, or as my mother calls it, the kushk in Jerusalem you've been obsessed with for your entire career. And my work on the Dome of the Chain specifically examines it as a space of encounter that, in a sense, at least from an Islamic perspective, is somewhat timeless. The Dome of the Chain, constructed to commemorate what was believed to be a chain of light that aided the prophet King David in the dispensation of justice. So this project specifically looked at the Dome of the Chain as an Islamic response to a space of encounter that predated the Muslim presence, but specifically focused on David's presence on the site of the temple, rather than the expected Solomonic reference. So in a sense, by looking at this site as an encounter that starts from the time of David and the moment of the chain descending to aid him as judge and ruler, to the end of days when it appears once again. So in a sense, this consideration of the space of encounter is something that I use to approach this question of pluralism. Could I have the second slide, please? The second site I'd like to show you, different space, different time. This is the Nilometer in Cairo, which dates from the 9th century. The Dome of the Chain is Umayyad. It dates from the end of the 7th. Totally different structure, but potentially very similar as the space of encounter. And the Nilometer is a gauge, is a way to measure the flood, the Nile flood. And you can see here, this shot shows you the interior of the well, and that column is the gauge. Now, over time, this column starts to be treated like a relic, and it receives anointment, and all sorts of rich rituals and ceremonies emerge around the Nilometer. But of course, the Nilometer, even though this dates from the Abbasid period, what my research, by considering this as a space of encounter, affirms this idea that we have Nilometers being constructed immediately upon the arrival of Muslims into El Fustat in Egypt. But of course, the synergies with the Nilometer as the quintessential Egyptian measuring device, obviously, and the continuation of practice and use of ancient Egyptian, Ptolemaic, and late antique Nilometers in parallel with this Abbasid Nilometer. So to add or to reflect on NASSER's idea of pluralism, I'd like to actually go back and look at the notion of the encounter. So rather than thinking of these voices coming together, can we consider them as being tethered to specific points or ideas? So in the case of the Dome of the Chain, they're tethered to the idea of Davidic justice, specifically this notion of commemoration of a chain. And that chain itself is acting as an agent of God. And of course, the Nilometer, as measuring the Nile as it does, is measuring in a very practical and pragmatic way how much God loves you, right? Because depending on the rising and fall of the flood, you're able to make a very powerful statement as a ruler of how well you're doing. So in a sense, these may seem like divergent structures, but actually by considering them as these tethers, these spaces that force everyone to come together. You can't get away from justice, and you can't get away from the Nile. So rather than considering necessarily these voices coming together of their own volition, I'm really interested in how certain agents force an encounter. And the nature of that tether, how tightly tethered you are to that point, how far you circulate from that tether, how your tethers get entangled, all tell these stories of these multiple voicings. And to invoke our musicians, thinking in terms of polyphony is extremely useful. But I'd also like to introduce another sort of musical reference here, thinking in terms of overtones, which are the sounds that you hear when a note is played, even though that note wasn't even played. So in a sense, what I hear at the Nilometer are the overtones of every Nilometer that's ever been built in Egypt. So a 9th century monument with overtones all the way back to the past. Thank you.
Thank you, Hiba. Also from the University of Toronto, we have Linda Northrup, who is the Associate Professor of Middle Eastern and Islamic History at the Department of Near and Middle Eastern Civilizations at the University of Toronto. Linda?
First, I would like to thank FILIZ CAKIR Philip for the invitation to participate today. It is an honor, but more than that, it has provided an opportunity for me to look at one of my favorite research projects from a new perspective and to think about it in a way that I had not done before. I discovered that the visual evidence for the monument that I will be mentioning, and we have the slide of it here now, paints a very different picture from the textual evidence, at least in some respects. And so I end up with more questions than I've answered in a way, and new questions to conduct some research on. Broadly speaking, my research concerns Egypt and Syria during the Mamluk period 1250 to 1517. My focus today, however, will be on the late 13th century. The Mamluks were a military slave regime. They themselves were from diverse backgrounds and ruled over a diverse and in many respects pluralistic society. The Mamluks themselves were of diverse origins. In the early period, they were predominantly Kipchak Turk, while in the later period, Circassian ethnicity prevailed. But many other origins were represented among their ranks. In addition, Egypt and Syria were populated by their indigenous populations, as well as by Arabs, Greeks, Byzantines, Kurds, Turkomans, Maghrebis from North Africa, Persians, Crusaders, and others. Jews, Christians, and Muslims lived in close proximity to each other and sometimes had warm and cordial relationships. The society was also on the move. Diplomats, merchants, students, soldiers, pilgrims, and refugees traversed the Mamluk realms from one end to the other and beyond. So there were abundant opportunities for cultural exchanges. More specifically, my research has focused on the funerary complex of the Mamluk Sultan Qalawun, who reigned from 1279 to 1280 CE. Founded in Cairo at the end of the 13th century, and that is the monument that is displayed here. This is the facade of the monument that I will be discussing. The complex consists of three elements: the Sultan's Kubba or turba, the two terms are used interchangeably, a madrasa, and a hospital. The term used is bimaristan, or maristan rather than the modern term for hospital. It is a term of Persian origin. Given the social demographic context, it is not surprising, perhaps, that this complex provides an exceptional example of artistic pluralism and innovation. This was the first monument of its kind, that is, including these three elements in one complex in Cairo. Let me summarize the evidence for pluralism and innovation in these structures. It was the first time in Cairo, I believe, that a ruler had built a mausoleum for himself during his own lifetime. He is also the first sultan to have conceived of a complex that would not only include these three elements, he was the first to have conceived of a complex that would include these three elements: the turba, the hospital, and the madrasa. He is also the first ruler to have encroached on the formerly open parade grounds in the Bain al-Kasrain, between the two palaces, the Fatimid palaces, which remained open until that point. The location of the hospital was selected quite deliberately. Qalawun intended that his tomb be placed directly opposite that of his master, Asal Hayyub, demonstrating not only his loyalty, but also creating a new ceremonial lieu de mémoire, as Jo van Steenbergen has called it. The elements of his structures are placed in new positions within the complex. For example, according to Doris Behrens Abu Saif, the minaret is placed in artful juxtaposition to the dome at the north corner of the complex, whereas it normally would have been placed near the entrance. Behrens Abu Saif further suggests that the minaret was positioned thus to form an association with the minaret of Beybar's madrasa, which is no longer standing, that would have been seen by and impressed those coming from the north. Beybars was a colleague of Qalawun. As Behrens Abu Saif also points out, it was the first structure in the city to demonstrate an articulated urban aesthetic in the way in which the exterior walls conformed to street requirements, while internally the space provided for religious requirements. With regard to the architectural features and decoration of the complex, Robert Hillenbrand best sums it up, noting the many foreign influences in this building, he states, and I quote, "There is an ecumenical flavor in the range of origins attested to in these borrowings. It is as if the entire Mediterranean world had been systematically trawled for ideas so as to make this foundation monument truly representative of its time." In this regard, one can point to the triple windows, possibly of Norman Sicilian inspiration, the similarity of the facade, the double-framed and pointed recess arches, to that of the Cathedral of Palermo. The square-based minaret may be of Andalusian inspiration, but perhaps most importantly, the plan of the tomb chamber echoes that of the Kubba Sahra, the Dome of the Rock, in Jerusalem, which itself seems to be derived from late antique church origins or designs, including even the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. However, I am not an art historian. I work with texts. While considering the extraordinary artistic pluralism exhibited in Kowloon's complex for our discussion today, I was struck by the contrasting view of the social, religious, political context attested by the textual evidence. This despite what one might expect to find in the field of medicine, the most pluralistic of professions. The profession was, even at this date, still dominated by Christians and Jews. So the point I would like to make here is that perhaps we should not be carried away, and I know this puts a slight damper, it's contrary to the theme today, but I can't help but tell you about this. We should not be carried away by any romantic notion of pluralism, that relations between Muslims, Christians, and Jews were just fine, not subject to tensions, for that is not what the textual evidence suggests. Excuse me. The focal point of my research to date has been primarily the hospital. The hospital, incidentally, appears to have been the Sultan's main interest as well, for he provided an unusually rich endowment for it. My interest in this institution was initially piqued by the discovery of several documents pertaining to its founding. The Waqfiyya, or endowment deed, a letter of appointment for the professorship in medicine at the hospital, for it was a teaching hospital, and a letter of appointment to the Riyasat Atib, or the chief physicianship of Egypt. Both posts were occupied by one and the same person, so they are related. Both are found side by side in the chronicle of Ibn al-Furat, who died in 807 or 14 Hijri, 1405, 1406, about then, Common Era. To be noted is that the appointee to both posts was from a Christian family. He had converted to Islam just in time to accept the position of Rais Atib. It is of some interest that the narrative regarding the motivation behind the founding of this institution suggests something very different from those recorded by contemporary chroniclers. One chronicler, for example, suggests that Kowloon was inspired to build the complex by the beauty of the tomb complex he had built for his wife. Another suggests that while on a military campaign in Syria, the Sultan fell ill and was successfully treated with medications from the hospital built by the Zengid ruler, Nur ad-Din, in the 12th century. Upon his recovery, he vowed that should he ever become Sultan one day, he would build a hospital to match that of Nur ad-Din's. Still another suggestion is that at some point earlier in his career, his troops had gone on a rampage in Cairo, killing and maiming many of his subjects, whereupon he felt remorse and vowed to make amends by building the hospital. The documents preserved by Ibn al-Furat, however, tell a very different story. The Sultan is said to have been dismayed by the fact that his predecessors had all built madrasas, none had built hospitals. Yet the hadith says, and I haven't been able to find the origin of this hadith. I don't think it's prophetic. It's not found in any of the canonic collections. Al-ilm ilman, ilm al-adyan wa ilm al-badan. Knowledge is of two kinds, physical and religious. So Kowloon had decided to build a hospital. Perhaps he hoped to show himself to be a better Muslim than his predecessors and thereby win support and legitimacy. In any case, the Waqfiyya contains a clause that forbids the employment of Christians and Jews in the hospital, nor were non-Muslims to be treated there. However, the letter of appointment carries this even further and makes the intent of the hospital even more clear. It states that by these initiatives in support of medical education, doctors will be trained in all the various specializations so that tomorrow there will be several times as many Muslim physicians as there are today. The ultimate goal appears to have been the Islamicization of the medical profession. How interesting it is then that while the complex itself suggests a society or at least a rulership open to innovation and diverse ideas, one that is echoed, by the way, by the demographics of the period in which saw refugees from both East and West flooding into Syria and Egypt, another strong current suggests a certain resistance to this openness. So to conclude, the research that I did for today's discussion has opened new questions. How is it possible that the hospital seems to reflect a very different current in society from the one that we have witnessed to date in the discussion? And also one that I have always actually thought was connected to the Sultan himself. I do not feel that he was a particularly pious person. He may have been open to these ideas. I think he had an interest in medicine. So my question is, how did the hospital end up in a kind of pushback to the openness and atmosphere of reception to other ideas that we've seen? So I will have to continue my thinking about this as a result of today. So thank you very much.
Next is Vera Simone Schulz, who's a research collaborator at the Kunsthistorische Institute in Florence, the Max Planck Institute.
Thank you, and I would also like to thank Bradley and Sharon for setting up the RSA panel yesterday, and particularly FILIZ now for organizing this thoughtful roundtable. Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here. My research focuses on the impact of imported artifacts on the visual and material culture of medieval and early Renaissance Italy, with a special emphasis on Tuscany and Florence. And this concerns both the built environment. I'm showing you an example of the so-called bacini, that is ceramic bowls from various regions of the Mediterranean that arrived in Tuscany and were incorporated into church facades. And it concerns primarily the artistic responses of local artists, local painters in this case, representing a Mamluk silk weaving in pictorial space. It also concerns the key role that artifacts from the Islamic world played in discourses of the time. I'm just showing you a quotation from Petrarch, a famous 14th century Italian writer, who compared Islamic artifacts from Mamluk Syria and Egypt of the time. He's speaking about inlaid metalwork with the most sought after metalwork of antiquity from Corinth. So saying that in antiquity, people went to Corinth to get the most precious metalwork. Now it is from Damascus that these objects come and capture your eyes and your minds. Now, the way how artists in medieval and early Renaissance Italy responded to these objects, the creative responses you can see in this case, Gentile da Fabriano's composition of the Virgin with a halo that kind of is evoking a Mamluk platter. And to just show you one example of the trajectories that these very intricate image-object interrelations could take, I'm showing you the tabernacle of the Annunciation in Santissima Annunziata in Florence. the first Annunciation that we know of that includes an Oriental, in quotation marks, carpet in an Annunciation scene, Anatolian pile carpet as one from the Metropolitan Museum in New York. And since this image was venerated as a miraculous image, many other churches wanted to have a similar image, thinking that the miraculous power would kind of transcend from the original to the copies. Now, since the first original included a carpet, the copies did as well. So the pile carpet, the floor covering, became a visual element of Annunciation scenes, not only in Florence, you see here examples from the 14th and early 15th century, but also beyond. And then artists at some point started to play with this visual element, changing, for instance, not only the length and the pattern of the carpet, but also its position in the image. So here it is not in front of the Virgin, but it seems to be the landing surface of the angel. And the most intricate, let's say, visual game played in this tradition is perhaps the composition by Piero del Pollaiuolo, a Florentine artist who did not include the carpet as a bridge between the Virgin and the angel, so you look in vain for the motif. But then if you follow the lines, perspective lines in this very precious room, enticing the view of the beholder into the background, you actually see the carpet in the very back. There's a window opening on the left, where the carpet hangs over the balcony next to a peacock and next to the city, a view of the city of Florence. The city where this original Annunciation with the first carpet is, and also the city that is rich and proud of its trade, that of course included imported objects such as precious carpets. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Vera. The last speaker for this afternoon is Sharon Smith, who was my long-time colleague, and now she is the head of Distinctive Collections and Associate Academic at Arizona State University. We miss you, Sharon.
Can you run it from the beginning? Okay. Mine is very choreographed, you see, so I have to match. No, just kidding. In discussing artistic pluralism in the medieval Mediterranean, I think we cannot, and perhaps should not, maybe cannot's too strong, look for an origin. In the words of Mark Bloch, when considering the word origins, he stated, "Does it simply mean beginning? On the other hand, is origins to be taken as the cause? In popular use, an origin is the beginning which explains. Worse still, a beginning which in the complete explanation. There lies the ambiguity, and there lies the danger." Although an origin may be clear to the researcher, lucky researcher if they find it, oftentimes the direction of a shared motif is not clear. It's running, it's okay. And examples, vary. There's the example of Ablak. Did it start in the Middle East? Did it start in Italy? Did it go back and forth? There's lots of research on that. Other examples of sort of ambiguous origins would be looking at where and when blasons came from and heraldic devices. We see them primarily in the Renaissance, early Italy, and then the Crusaders, and maybe it's the Crusaders who introduced the Mamluks to this. But this goes on. So what I really would rather look at, rather than trying to find an origin in this pluralistic Mediterranean, is to look at reception. And my project, which is not this, but I'm going to talk about this in a second, promise. It's important to note this mutual transmission of forms from west to east and from east to west, and to examine these transmissions in light of the language of production vis-a-vis the language of reception. Again, how artists, patrons, institutions adopt a foreign motif and actively incorporate that into local production. I don't want to talk about influence because that's one dominating another. I want to talk about an active incorporation. And so we examine sort of what are seemingly disparate places, in my case, Florence and Cairo, but we're not looking for origins, we're looking for the impact of the transmission or the adoption or adaptation of certain artistic or architectural forms. More important than that is the evolving relationship, is the examination of the, sorry, I'm lost. That confused me. More important than the examination of their evolving relationship, Florence and Cairo I'm speaking about, is examination of the aforementioned developments, which are not unique to the East or to the West, nor are they the result of one culture's dominance or dependence on another, but they're part of a more complex phenomenon, again, part of the larger pluralistic pan-Mediterranean. The reason, and this was not choreographed well, because on my laptop with guest Wi-Fi, this would just be finishing, but clearly it went much faster. Some of you might be familiar with this. This is Layer Cake, a tool that I was involved in at MIT. Had the pleasure of working, oh, it's running again, thank you. Had the pleasure of working with Ali Asghar Alibhai and James Yamada on building this tool, which is actually a 3-axis map. So the axes are time, narrative, and space. But what I'm really showing you here is the Hajj journey of Ibn Jubair, 13th century, 12th century actually, sorry, traveler. And you can see how he's moving through the Mediterranean and back to Granada. This gives you an idea of just how ideas could have been exchanged and transferred and how they were. Luckily, Ibn Jubair was a prolific writer. He described everything he ever saw. This list over here on your left would be every city he stopped at. And if we had time, you would go to that city and then there'd be a description, a translation from the original text that would tell you what he was doing there or what he thought about it. The other thing, this is actually a good lesson for people who do digital humanities. Those colors mean something, but you can't tell because we ran out of money and nobody would fund it again. But the colors are the fourth dimension that we actually were mapping, which was the ghurba, or the emotional state of the traveler. And so if there was a key, which there is not, you would know that in Granada, when he left on the ship, he was happy. When he travels through the Mediterranean, he goes to the Maghreb, gets on a Christian ship, still happy. So you see Christians and Muslims traveling together on the ship, no problem. Goes to Alexandria, transfers again. He only starts to get panicked, and that's where you see the red colors, in the Levant, because he's running into Crusaders, and of course that scares him. And then off the coast of Sicily, where his ship sank, and he almost drowned. So if we could have finished it, you would know that from a key. Right now you have to rely on me telling you. Hopefully, another digital humanities comment. When you do something like this, you want to have commitment from your institution to support it ongoing. After you're gone, this should live on. It should continue to develop. It really should. So this, though, was just an example of just how fluid the Mediterranean can be and the types of people that are crossing it willingly, easily, and therefore the exchange is happening. And it is really a pan-pluralistic Mediterranean. Thank you.
Thank you. How much time do we have? Thank you all. 41 years ago, the late Edward Said, who was probably one of the best, if not the best, diagnoser of our current states, said, how can one, I'm actually rephrasing, I don't remember it quite correctly, but he says, how can one divide human history, as human history seems to be genuinely divided into people, cultures, periods, traditions, and so on, and survive that division humanely and morally. So my question to my panelists, and perhaps actually some of them might want to answer it, some of them might not, is what do you think is the moral and historiographical implication of, or implications in a plural, of the kind of research that you are doing? Because it seems to me that what pluralism somehow is implying in here is that that division into sort of like solid categories, wherever those categories are, is being proven by the kind of research that we are hearing about here in art history, which is actually a latecomer into this attempt at actually going after that solid division and showing how fluid, unstable, shifting, and changing it has been and it still is. So if anyone would like to pick up from here, and then we'll move it to the audience and see if anyone has any questions.
What occurred to me was, as I was preparing for today, was that it really came as a shock to me to realize that there's all this visual evidence of pluralism in that one monument and innovation, which indicates to me that the builders, the patron, must have had an open mind about it. But then in the textual evidence, to find something so contrary that is at odds with that. And I've just, I mean, my tentative conclusion is that it's not safe to rely on just textual evidence or perhaps on just visual evidence to draw conclusions about the society at that time. And I think, actually, it shouldn't be such a shock in a way because, I mean, we still have this kind of atmosphere today, I mean, very much so.
I would just like to piggyback on that and to talk about this person of the Sultan Qalawun, who is obviously a complex personality. On the one hand, that building could be seen as a manifestation of pluralism in this corporation of all of these various visual elements, crusader elements, materials. This is an example of spolia, materials taken from pharaonic culture, from earlier Egyptian civilization, etc. But Qalawun was a jihadist, I guess you could say, or a jihadi himself, a mujahid, who went on crusade against Christians and was planned other crusades that he did not, unfortunately, get to complete. He potentially, from some of the sources, actually used Christian captives to build his monument. And Mongols as well. So used prisoners of war to build his own monument that used Christian materials or Christian styles in it. So in that one person, you have the encapsulation of so many contradictions that you can really get down to the individual level in terms of how our cultural hybridity or our cultural pluralism actually played out in 13th century Cairo.
With this, I thank you all, and I let you go to experience some conviviality outside now.